when we look and analyze kind of ads and campaign performance, undoubtedly the things that work better are when our customers are talking, so our case studies get way more engagement they get like 3 times more engagement than some of our ads do. And so what that tells us is that people care about what customers are saying. They want to kind of understand people in the market that they either look up to or have a similar DNA to them, and they want to understand and have that social proof of something working. So that context is really important in telling that story.
How do you typically draft that perfect messaging that resonates with customers?
So ultimately, as a business, our end result is to drive 3 key outcomes. One is reduce risk, reduce cost, and then the third one is increased revenue. So every single product feature that we release should fit comfortably into at least one of those buckets, if not more. And so when we're doing a release, we're always kind of keeping that top of mind, like what's the value framework, which business outcomes is this helping to deliver. So I think that's really key, linking that value to the business outcomes and what this means for a customer. And then it's very much kind of leading with that kind of value messaging.
So thanks so much, Danielle, and welcome to this episode of How to Launch. Shall we start with some housekeeping? Maybe we'll talk a little bit about yourself. Maybe we can also get into the detail of how big your product marketing team is, and how do you collaborate with the commercial teams.
Yeah, certainly. Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me today. And I can give you a bit of an intro to me. So I head up the product marketing function at a company called Paddle. And Paddle is in the payment space. So they're a merchant of record, which means that they help SaaS and digital product companies sell their products online. But they act as a merchant, which means that they take on all of the legalities and compliance around the sale too. So I head up the product marketing function, and product marketing at Paddle is actually 3 teams. So it's product marketing, customer marketing, and content strategy. If we're thinking about just native product marketing, I have currently 3 people in seat, and then myself, and we're actually recruiting one more person too. So the way that the product marketing team is structured is, for the most part, I have 2 and will soon have a third PMM that sits across different product domains. So even though from on a surface level for a customer, it's one platform, we have 3 kind of core domain streams. So we have payments, we have billing, and we have experience. And so for me, it's really important that we have product marketing managers working very closely with those different squads, from kind of discovery through to adoption. In addition to that, I have another product marketing manager who's currently in seat, who works more in kind of market insights, and he has a more kind of niche role where he caters for our mobile app audience, and that audience is very different to our general kind of ICP and personas. So his role is kind of more market led, and kind of sits across and lays across some of the other domains. And then product marketing, like in most companies, is at the intersection of many different departments. So we work very closely with product, we work very closely with customer success, also with sales and also with marketing, but obviously not limited to those teams. Based on what we do as an organisation, sometimes that also includes working with the finance team, the risk team, the legal team. But generally speaking, we kind of sit in that centre space between those teams. And our job largely is taking the very technical with the product team, and working on the kind of strategy and positioning and messaging, and ultimately the distribution channel. So working very closely with that commercial side of the organisation on how you take these products and features to market.
Very interesting, Daniel. Yeah, thank you for that introduction. And also, you did mention that there's obviously product marketing, but there's also content, there's also customer marketing. Do we have a starting point when it comes to launches? Like maybe the product marketing team, the core product marketing team starts it, or maybe the content team starts it. Can you elaborate on how that flows?
Yeah, absolutely. So content didn't always live in product marketing. It actually came into the product marketing space about 18 months ago at Paddle. And it works really nicely. So the great thing about having content working so closely with PMM is there's a lot more kind of consistency in our themes and our messaging and the features that we're releasing to market. So it feels like a very kind of holistic kind of team. But when it comes to releases, that's very much in the space of PMM. So what tends to happen is they're the ones that kick off the market launch, and then what they do is they get content involved in that journey along the way. Now, where customer marketing comes into play, and largely I'm playing the role of customer marketer at the moment, but we are looking to expand the team much broader, is really looking at how we engage with customers. So it's one thing to kind of take products and features to market and to communicate those to customers on launch, but it's another thing kind of keeping them consistently engaged. Like, how do we make sure that we're deriving value for our customers? You know, how do we make sure that we're driving adoption? But also, how do we really get that voice of the customer into a lot of the marketing that we're doing? So speaking to our customers is kind of paramount of what we do at Paddle. So we don't go a week without speaking to at least one customer on the team. And case studies has been a very big focus for us too.
So when you look out for customer marketing folks, by the way, Danielle, like, do you look out for product marketing people and then kind of like sit with customer marketing? Is that the case, or do you look for a different skill set at all?
It's interesting actually, because I think that they can come from different routes. So I think if you've had somebody in a kind of customer success function, they understand customers very well, and so actually they can have a very good gauge. If they've got a good marketing eye, they can have a very good gauge because they're very customer centric. But actually, the beauty of hiring PMMs too, that have kind of that broad customer experience, is their roles are quite multifaceted. So they're quite strategic in their approach to things. So if you happen to come across a PMM who has broad customer experience, it's always a winner, because I feel like you've got those kind of rich, multifaceted skills that are used to working very cross-functionally. So for me, I'm kind of looking more at somebody that's more customer centric, which is the most pivotal thing. But ultimately, if you're able to happen upon somebody that has those multifaceted skills and works well between teams, that always serves us very well in a business.
How do we go about defining what a big launch looks like and what's a small launch? How do you, if there's like a tiering system, and what are the best practices? What do you typically recommend?
Yeah, definitely. That's a great question. And I think it very much depends on the size and the impact the release is expected to have. So we do have a tiering system at Paddle. We have R1, R2, and R3. And in addition to that, we have kind of micro releases and also internal updates. So an R1 would be a combo of a big differentiator in the market, something you're launching that's really expected to kind of make a big impact or a big splash in the market, or something that's going to really help to drive new business for us. And then we go to like an R2. So an R2 is still kind of a fairly big release, but perhaps isn't so big in scale and impact. So that could be a differentiator, or it could be new business. It could be something that helps to prevent customers from churning. It could be a number of different things, but potentially not as large and expected to have such a big impact. And then we look at kind of an R3, and an R3 could be like a level setter. So it could be something that's kind of table stakes in the market. Or it could be a churn prevention play. So it could be, again, something that customers have frequently asked for, that helps to kind of really demonstrate value and like we're listening to customers. So it could be kind of an incremental improvement that certainly might not be kind of all encompassing or help us to really win new business, but will help to kind of move the needle a bit, both with customers and new opportunities. And then we have micro releases. So in the nature of what we do, we're always kind of making updates to things like tax updates. And those updates are pretty small. You know, they don't require a level of kind of go to market. And so usually there are a few things you need to check over before you release a change log or provide an update, but they don't tend to take a lot of time and effort. So we call those micro releases. And then in addition to that, we have internal improvements. Now, internal improvements could be anything that we're doing to make the platform more secure and robust. It could also be stuff that we're using, that we're doing to derive more efficiencies with our external kind of with our payments platform. So these are things that kind of help to drive efficiencies that either are things that we would note and update the team on, and wouldn't necessarily tell customers, or maybe it is something that is significant enough to tell customers about. So it's not a shiny new feature, but it's something that we're doing that's deriving some sort of value for them behind the scenes, and we feel that it's important to let them know. So the way in which we rank them can be very different. The one thing that I will say is that we often sometimes see that they can shift. So usually the kind of ranking is set at PMM and product level. So in the early stages, when we're looking at kind of at market insight and customer feedback, and we're looking at the size of this feature, we might have positioned it as at a certain release. And then throughout the process, as we start to learn more, we speak to our commercial org, we start to dig a bit deeper. Sometimes that can change the direction in which we see that release ranking going. So sometimes we upgrade it to something more important, and sometimes we downgrade it and think, actually, you know what, this is a good this is a great feature, but actually it perhaps isn't going to have the impact in the market that we think it might have, and therefore actually the effort to roll out might be slightly different in our approach. And then typically what we have as well is a release process, and it's the release process is kind of taken with a pinch of salt, because I think in addition to looking at the size of the release, there's also the type of release that you're doing. And so it's not kind of like a one size fits all, but what it does is provide some guiding principles on, if you're looking at this as an R1 release, here's kind of a list of menu items of things that you might want to consider. And then it kind of breaks down the teams that you would need to work with, who would own different components of those different activities. And it helps to kind of shape the way in which you think about the release. And then lastly, I guess, is the go to market release brief. And that's your kind of single source of truth of everything pertaining to that release. So all of your information around technical documentation links out to things that are really important about that release, or your value propositions and business outcomes, all of the messaging you have for your internal teams about what it means for your different commercial orgs and leaders. Any early access programs and results that you see would all be contained within this brief, so that at the end of the process, when it comes to release, not only are you able to kind of get cross-functional sign-off with everybody aligned that we're all kind of on the same page around how we're talking about it and how we're positioning it, but everything's kind of contained in one space. So the go-to-market becomes like the central source of everything, the go-to-market brief.
Is it just the product marketing team who sits in on the decision as to how do we classify a release into the R2 bucket or the R1 bucket? Or are there more stakeholders? And I'm asking because let's say we consider a release to be an R2, is there at any point a concern raised by the commercial team that, hey, we should focus more
Yeah.
on this particular release because we believe there's more value and then we should think about it, right? Is there, so who sits in on the decision making as to how do we classify and then
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I think the key thing really is bringing people in early enough. So, obviously you don't want to go too wide with your go to market before you've got kind of a more fully baked plan. But you also, it's important to bring people into the discussions early enough. So for me, it typically comes at the point of, once we've decided we're building something and we have kind of projected dates, that would be the time to start to get the commercial leaders involved in that conversation too. So typically what would happen is we would initially come with a release ranking at product marketing and product level. So we would decide, this is going to be an R2 release, for example. And then we would engage the commercial leaders. And I've had a few situations where we have changed the ranking. And I can give you an example if it's helpful for context. But last year we took to market, we released South Korean payment methods. Now, the premise behind releasing these was very much a churn prevention method. So we had a customer who had a high volume of buyers in South Korea. It was really important to them that they had localized payment methods. We were at risk of losing them to a competitor. So it was very much a case of, they're one of our top customers. We should really be thinking about this from a localized angle. So initially we were kind of looking at this as an R2, that very much fell in that kind of customer retention bracket. We did kind of analyze the wider landscape of customers. We didn't have a huge pool of customers that were serving that South Korean market. But actually what we realized throughout that process was a few things, is that having those conversations with the commercial team meant that, first of all, it wasn't just one payment method, it was 4 alternative payment methods and 22 domestic cards. So actually we weren't just taking a payment method, we were bolstering our payment offering quite substantially. So that in itself was quite significant. I think the second thing was, it came around the time of releasing other releases, features, sorry, that fitted more into kind of more of an APAC play. So there was a wider theme here. So we had a kind of cohort of prospects in the kind of APAC area, and actually this, along with X, Y, and Z release, helped to kind of really bolster this idea of creating a bit more value for our potential customers in that region. The third thing was we had at the time kind of had an influx of inquiries through gaming, and a lot of kind of South Korea represents like the fourth largest gamer base in the world. So again, that gave us a different angle in terms of the go to market. And so ultimately, I think with all of those things considered, we were like, actually, this could be a bigger opportunity for us than we realize. This isn't just a customer retention piece. This is potentially like winning a lot more new business. And so it's been a huge success for us. We kind of rolled it out in a managed way initially, but we've seen some huge uplift. And actually, what's really interesting is a lot of our customers that weren't asking about it have actually managed to expand more into South Korea as a result of having these localized payment methods. So having the commercial insight into that was really key.
So what's ideal for us to start planning for such a launch? Is it like 3 months, 6 months, and
Yeah, I mean, planning is really key, but we all know that, sometimes we have to rush these things to market, and that's not the ideal scenario for a PMM. I've worked in scenarios where things have been accelerated super fast and we've taken something to market in a matter of weeks, and it's all encompassing go to market, and you're still kind of playing catch up afterwards. And then you have those that kind of span a longer period of time, and they go really deep, and there's you have to keep momentum going throughout that process. In the scenario of South Korean payment methods, that was probably like a 2 month kind of go to market. We obviously had to do some due diligence on it first, check that it was performing in the way that we expected. So we did have an early access program. And I think if you're doing a degree of early access, you have to bake in a bit of extra time, not just for the kind of distribution angles, but making sure that things are running and you're validating things in the way that you would like to. On the other end of the scale, one of the biggest launches I've done at Paddle is, and I think I was only at Paddle for about 3 months before we decided to do this, but Paddle Billing, which is what we're calling it now, is the product that we took to market about 18 months ago. So it was basically like a reimagined version of our existing MOR platform. So the business had been in operation for about 11 years. The technology, was working fine for customers, but we got to a stage where we had wanted to advance some of the features that we were offering. So we wanted to have a much greater subscriptions offering. We wanted to build more flexibility into the platform. We wanted to innovate and ship faster. And that actually meant building a new tech stack. So that in itself took about 9 months to take to market. So again, varied difference in the types of releases that you'd have. But that would have certainly been classed as an R1.
okay, that makes sense. And well, 3 months in, and then you had a major release to work with. So that must have been a lot. But and also probably a fantastic start to joining the organization.
Do you know what? It was amazing. I look back now and it was absolutely terrifying at the time, but I learned so much about Paddle and about our customers. So it was a really interesting time. And then layered into that, just to make it even more complex, we had just gone through an acquisition too. So we had acquired a business called Profitwell. So we'd gone overnight. On the day that I joined, I found this out, by the way. We'd gone from a one product company to a multi-product company that was then replatforming. So there were lots of different kind of elements involved in this. So a very busy and challenging time, but ultimately worked out very well.
Great times indeed. I've heard a lot about Profitwell, so yeah, congratulations on the acquisition.
Thank you.
Let's actually go to the billing product. So for that in particular, how did the enablement look like?
Yeah, definitely. I think a release on that scale like includes a proper kind of program. There's some releases that we do that might still be big in size, but they're quite easy to interpret. So they can range from anything from a readout through to a session to multiple sessions. But in the case of paddle billing, it was a very kind of multifaceted enablement program. Um, at Paddle, we actually have an enablement team that works very closely with product marketing. So in previous roles, enablement's always been part of my function, but we're lucky enough to have an enablement team here. So we work really closely with them from the early stages. And as I mentioned, it was very much a multifaceted kind of approach. So we broke it down into chunks. Explaining the what and the why and bringing people on the journey as to why we decided to get here. What's this going to help us to do in terms of expanding our addressable market? um, Deep diving into features and taking them through demos. Ultimately, these people are going to be selling or marketing our product, so they need to kind of understand what the tool looks like. We talk through kind of implementation. We talk through kind of market insights and competitor landscape. And there was real differentiated enablement across the different kind of segments and teams. So even in the sales team alone, you've got those working SMB, mid-market, enterprise strat. We actually started the strat enablement much earlier, just because before the product was released, just because we knew that the time to market would have been much longer. They were almost like our guinea pigs for the rest of the enablement program. So we kind of took them through the enablement first, and then we iterated with the mid-market and SMB teams. But meeting people where they're at, the solutions team need that extra deep dive into implementation. They need to understand more of the technical specifics. So we had to make sure that their programs and their enablement very much encompass bringing some of our technical and engineering and product leaders into the room to make sure they could answer questions that they had around implementation. Our customer success teams, for example, in addition to enabling them, we also had to really understand what their needs were for their customer. We could make some assumptions, but actually getting that feedback was really important too. Like, what questions do our customer success team have? And they're the ones that are kind of exposed to our customers on a day-to-day basis. So what else do they need to be explained to them so that they can then have conversations with our customers too? So the approach we took was very tailored to the type of teams that we worked for. Marketing was a bit more light touch. They didn't need to get into the weeds of every bit of the detail. But what we did do was we recorded all of the sessions, and we enabled marketing to make that choice as to whether or not they wanted to dive a bit deeper. So my team, for example, in content would always kind of be interested in that extra layer. But for some people, they didn't need to. And so it gave them the option of kind of listening to things in a very interactive environment and being able to ask questions firsthand, but also being able to have that deep dive. And I think having that mix is really important, because you've got that information to loop back to, but giving people that forum to be able to ask questions directly definitely makes a big impact to your enablement program.
So let's say we start planning that launch and we have like X, Y, and Z items. Let's say that's a checklist item of 20 things to cover, right? But
Yeah.
as we're actioning one of the items or one of the people that we're speaking to is CSMs and they have a separate expectations, is there how do you recommend a product marketing person like go about e- evolving that plan on the way of finding out more information from the commercial team, right?
Yeah, you've hit upon a really key point here, because ultimately there are some things, like even with your best intentions, there are some things that won't be ready for launch if we are trying to meet a date. But there are some things that are non-negotiable, and I think anybody that's interfacing with a customer and has something that would require some degree of support would certainly need to be catered for within that kind of go-to-market release. And so what we tend to find is we bring our customer success managers and our support team in really early. And so I think one thing that I've learned through the process is I think initially when I first started out my product marketing journey, you wanted things to look really clean and really tidy and together before you got everyone involved. So it wasn't something like a half-baked idea. But actually what I realized quite early on is that bringing people into the conversation earlier is actually better, because if there are pivots and changes in the direction you're taking things, or actually the scale of what you need to produce in that time frame, you don't leave yourself much legroom unless you have had those conversations earlier. So I think it's always best to caveat this with, look, this is very much a work in progress, but as you're part of this kind of go to market working group, I want to get your opinions on this early. And so actually at Paddle we use Slack, and we don't just use Slack. We have meetings and stuff too, but it's a way of being able to connect with people async. So quite often we'll give people a bit of a heads up ahead of time to say, look, we've got X release coming. I'd love to get your thoughts on this. This is how we're thinking about it at the moment, but I'd love to get your feedback. And I think having those conversations really early is really key, because before you know it, you could be producing a large FAQs document to help the support team. You might need extra messaging for customers that you hadn't kind of factored into your comms plan. Your customer success team might want to take the managed customers themselves and have a differentiated set of messaging that goes out to the standard kind of messaging. And so your approach there is really important too. So I think bringing them into the conversation early is certainly key.
I couldn't help resonate with the clean plan that we always want as a PMM, huh? That because that we all have that desire, but I suppose almost never will we be able to accomplish that clean yeah, GTM plan. Let's actually double click on the messaging, Daniel. That's also a very interesting point that you mentioned. How do you typically draft that perfect messaging that resonates with customers? So that's the first thing. And then the second thing will be how do you validate what we've just drafted as a message actually works in the market?
Yeah, really good question. And I think some of that comes from the initial go-to-market briefs. The way in which it's structured is like, what's the kind of key value propositions? Like, what is this solving? So what challenge are we solving for? Is the key thing. So that's your value propositions. The one thing that we have at Paddle, which is quite unique, that I always try to wrap not just into our messaging for product features, but also in our case studies and the conversations that we have with customers too, is what business outcomes does it help to derive? So ultimately, as a business, our end result is to drive three key outcomes. One is reduce risk, reduce cost, and then the third one is increased revenue. So every single product feature that we release should fit comfortably into at least one of those buckets, if not more. And so when we're doing a release, we're always kind of keeping that top of mind, like what's the value framework? Which business outcomes is this helping to deliver? So I think that's really key, linking that value to the business outcomes and what this means for a customer. And then it's very much kind of leading with that kind of value messaging. So, you do need to describe a feature to an extent, but the feature means nothing without demonstrating the value. So if you've got any sort of impact stats or social proofing, that always really helps to resonate well with our customers. So what we try to do, if we've gone through like an early access program, to give people a degree of confidence and assurity in the release, we will normally release stats around kind of uplift and performance. Again, that helps to derive some of the value that we're seeing and the reasons and validating the reasons that we are doing this. And it helps to give them confidence in the things that we're doing. We will also kind of indicate if this has been something that has been based off customer feedback. So again, we'll make sure we layer that into our messaging too. This is very much kind of a customer-centric approach. We've had a number of requests for this feature, and which has incentivized us building it, and also some of the market insight too. So as part of the go-to-market, we're also looking at the kind of market and what competitors and stuff are doing, and we would never kind of draw out kind of differences competitively. That's for our own use. That's not kind of our mantra at Paddle, kind of going aggressively against competitors, but it does kind of really help us to kind of understand the market and where things are going. So if there are some stats that we can pull around, something that might have influenced the decision to build that feature, like we're seeing X amount of growth in this region, which is why we've enabled X payment methods, localized payment methods. Again, that helps to give them the story and the context as to why you're doing it. So it makes them feel that we're better serving their needs. Now, not everything obviously runs smoothly, even with your best intentions. The one thing that I will say is that I think the role of being in PMM is to be proud of your work, but not precious. And you should definitely run it through lots of different eyes before it goes out, but not to a point where you've got too many stakeholders and things get hold up. But your customer success team and your support team should definitely see the comms before they go. And you should also get feedback on that too. So if this is a release that goes out and it's confusing and you start to get kind of support tickets come through with people questioning or asking the same things, you've not quite nailed the positioning. And so I think it's really important to get that insight back. So on the customer side, certainly support, and then really leaning into your BDRs and your sales team. Even with your best intentions, you might have done all of your insight and all of your data and all of your research, but actually things don't just land in the way that you think they do. So it's really important to have that feedback loop coming back to you too, saying, actually, you know what? This isn't resonating the same way, but actually when I described it this way, this landed much better. And then that allows you to kind of update your messaging framework so that we all kind of benefit and that we are then kind of iterating and releasing things that make more sense to the market.
Do you typically account for, let's say, feedback and then sort of the ongoing iteration when we plan for that launch, or is that something that ad hoc that comes in and then we kind of keep that in mind?
I think it really depends on the release. Like sometimes there are kind of ongoing efforts. So often we will have a one and done approach to a product release. We might kind of spread the news out across different channels, but we might not kind of continue to bombard customers with the same update. But there are some things that we might kind of have as part of the nurture stream. So it could be something that we're looking to derive take up on. So we're priming them with information. And I can give you an example actually of something that we're currently working with customers on, which is migrations. So actually, one of the biggest challenges we had with paddle billing was that when we took it to market, we had two very different go-to-market approaches. This for us unlocked a whole new opportunity with new differentiated features. But also for our customers, they weren't able to take advantage of the new features from day one. There was a migration that was involved in that process. And so when we went to market, we didn't actually have a clear path for them. And so that's been a journey for us, and it's an ongoing journey. And I'm really pleased because we've come this journey with our customers, and we've had these sessions and we've incorporated it as part of our kind of regular updates. But that feedback's been really important. Understanding in the initial stages when we had type forms or support questions that came back, to really help then in our second stage of messaging to really think about how we're messaging that to customers. Like, what is it they care about? Is it this feature, or do they want to understand a bit more around the migration process and the timelines? What's their appetite for moving? What does this mean for those different cohorts? And actually what we've done is get a lot more specific. We have customers that sell one-time only products, and we have customers that sell subscriptions products, and we also have customers that use invoicing that are more B2B, and they could fit into either bracket on the subscriptions or the one-time only side. And so actually having this kind of regular cadence of updates and getting that feedback has meant that we can get very kind of personalized in our approach for those different cohorts around what's important for them.
Um, at the end of the release, so let's say once we've done that, and a couple of months have passed, is there a way that you go about actually assessing what's happened with the release and have we actually hit those targets, right? How do you approach this?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think we could do it better. I think that we do a really good job on the go-to-market side, but I think we could do a lot more on the adoption side. And we are getting better at it. I think having more resources and more people means that, we are not always kind of chasing our tail and getting to the next release afterwards, but we can be a bit more thorough with it. So actually, we are now looping back and looking at, since X has been released, let's go back and look at how many customers have actually enabled this. And if not, why are they not? And should we be doing a targeted campaign to these customers to talk about this? I think the other thing that's really important is to not look at your release as just a release. You need to look broader than just the initial release too. So, does this ladder up into a wider theme? Is this an opportunity to do win back? So really kind of thinking outside of the box of just that kind of the current release that you're working on. So I think it's really important to have those retrospectives. So after you've done a release, we would always do a retro anyway, but having those points where you're kind of looking back and analyzing that data and working with the PMs to understand what the adoption rates look like and whether or not we should be doing more to drive more awareness or value messaging, and trying to push a bit more on the adoption side. But also working with our CSM partners too. They are at the forefront, particularly with our managed customers, and seeing things too. So being able to arm them and get feedback on how they're landing, the features are landing with the customers is really important. But being able to push and say, actually, we've noticed XYZ customer of our managed accounts isn't actually using this yet, but could, derive some benefit. And they have a lot of the data behind that too. So again, I think it's going broad, but it's also doing that loop back. So in addition to getting that feedback loop when it comes to messaging, you should always kind of be looking at how well that's performed, not just at release, but how it's performing some months on.
Like capacity is always a problem, right? There are obviously quite a
It
lot of
is.
things
It's
that we
a
should.
problem. As I'm growing my team, though, I'm like, this is what we're going to do. Like, adoption's going to be our thing. We're gonna do more to drive more adoption.
I can imagine. Is there so obviously from a PMM perspective, there's adoption. There's also, I suppose, to a large degree, a hand in acquisition as well. Like, do you and even activation, right? Is there a bucket which you focus more on, or does that kind of depend on the release in itself?
I think it largely depends on the release. I think again, it comes down to the type of release you have. Like if it's an R3 and it's more of a kind of customer value proposition, it's probably not going to land in the same way with your sales team. And so looking at KPIs and success metrics in that regard, it's probably not going to have such a big impact. So I think it really depends on the type of release that you have. I also think that PMM is really difficult to quantify sometimes because there's some things that you do that have tangible impact, but you're not the only touch point, right? And so actually, largely a lot of the work that you do is unseen. When you think about the success that you have through the distribution channels, you're not normally the people that are pushing it out. You've got your DG teams, you've got your commercial leads. They're actually kind of taking that positioning and messaging and kind of out there actively selling or actively marketing. So there are some metrics that are really difficult to really quantify. And I think some of those metrics feel a bit kind of light and fluffy, but I think ultimately making sure that everybody is on the same page and that we've got kind of like a clear, consistent message in the market is also a metric in itself, but it's definitely much more difficult to track.
There, a follow-up on the success metric, by the way. So is there um a way to approach, let's say, that this conversation with senior leadership, because they are obviously thinking about like the business impact that each department makes, right? And I think from their perspective, it's all about, okay, which metric are we exactly tackling in which department? And I suppose the answer in some occasions will be tricky, right? That when we actually say that, oh, we made some impact on point X, but not necessarily on point Y, and there's no effective way to measure it. Is there, how do you recommend PMMs approach this conversation with the leadership team?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I think some things are a bit more straight cut, right? Like we for example, one of the products that we brought in from Profitwell was Profitwell Metrics, and Metrics is very much embedded as part of our kind of billing offering now anyway. But in the early stages, we had this kind of like target of getting like 80% of our addressable customers that were using subscriptions using Metrics. And and we were confident in it because we were like, well, it's free of charge. Like, why would they not take up on the value? But what I think we didn't anticipate was that sometimes these are like they take longer to get the value through. And actually some of these things require a bit of education in addition to it. So sometimes it's just making sure that your XLT team know that this isn't always just something that you see immediate impact for. Yeah, you might see a drive initially, but actually, like there's a number of different reasons why there won't be take up. So pricing point wasn't a thing here. Our platform is very much a one fee, and so you're not paying more for these things. And so logic tells you that they would just take up and derive the value. But actually, what we realized was this was more of a nurture stream. And actually, what we did was we ran a number of kind of like training campaigns where we were like, actually, this tool's really useful for people. If you're looking at data and insights and looking at understanding benchmarking and how you can like make derive insights and make decisions about your subscriptions, like you should really be using this tool. And so actually what we did was we released a series of kind of almost like training sessions for our customers that taught them a bit more around the value of metrics, and that's when we started to see kind of take up go. But you have to kind of make sure that your exco team are aware of the things that you're doing and the efforts that you're making in that regard. I think the other thing as well is just, going back to that whole kind of it's difficult to track certain metrics always pertaining to a product release. I think it's also understanding what your exco cares about. And product releases is one part of that, but actually another big part of PMM and customer marketing is your customers. And so actually we have a really big drive at Paddle around voice of customer. And so Jimmy, our CEO, he's passionate about customers. He wants to make sure that we are leveraging the stories, that we're speaking to customers, that we're really understanding the value. And I have to say, having your exco really invested in that and actually having kind of pipeline numbers attached to that derives benefits in many ways because it gives PMM a focus, and it also gives us a spotlight in a different way that falls outside of kind of just product, and it brings the customer to the center of what we do. So there's many people that work in a customer facing role, but many people don't get that exposure to customers. So being able to leverage those stories both internally and externally to the market is really key. And I think that there's just so much that you learn from your customers too. So there's a lot more when we look and analyze kind of ads and campaign performance. Undoubtedly, the things that work better are when our customers are talking. So our case studies get way more engagement than they get like 3 times more engagement than some of our ads do. And so what that tells us is that people care about what our customers are saying. They want to kind of understand people in the market that they either look up to or have a similar DNA to them, and they want to understand and have that social proof of something working. So that context is really important, telling that story. And so what we found is that we found different ways of bringing customers into that, whether that's through case studies where we mention products, whether that's doing product specific videos where we bring customers in to tell us a bit around how they've encountered that feature. We're finding more and more ways to integrate the customer at the heart of what we're doing, because ultimately that's what we're solving for in the first place.
100%. Yeah. And also what you've just said about storytelling, that's also an important point, right? This, I feel like a lot of people actually come back to emphasizing on the storytelling skill of product marketers, right? Is that oftentimes I notice that a customer story that we're telling, or is there a different way to tell the story about this the product or the release that we're working at?
It's a really interesting question because I think, undoubtedly customer stories resonate very well, but they don't help you in a situation when you're releasing something to market there and then. So unless they kind of tried and tested it and we're releasing a customer story off the back of a new release, that's never going to kind of wash in the early stages when you're taking something to market. But storytelling is really important, and I it's ironic because telling the stories is so much easier when you're having a conversation, right? But actually articulating that in words, particularly when you've got a short window of opportunity to get people's attention, is actually really difficult. And I think this is where I really lean on my content team too. And so I think one of the benefits and why I think that content strategy works so well with product marketing is, we product marketing is very much kind of the fact finders. They're the ones that kind of validate. We come into this very agnostic, looking at all the insights and collecting the best thing to get the best positioning. And what I love about content is they really help to kind of smooth that out in terms of a story. So they're very good at that kind of the creative elements, the narrative, the storytelling, and giving you a different insight. So often not what I find in our weekly meetings is, and the team meetings, by the way, are very kind of broad across the team. And we will talk. Like my favorite time of the week is our team meeting. So we've got a new release coming up. We've got like a new event or a big focus. We sit in that team meeting, we really iterate on it. Like PMMs might have come up with some initial positioning or a story, but we flesh it out as a team in that session. And actually having that layer of insight from the content team and helping to fine tune that and have something and to help to kind of tell that story a bit better has been really impactful.
Are there any stakeholders that the PMMs actually rely on when you share? So who does the release plan go out to?
The product marketer owns the go to market release document, and the product manager is very involved in that too. But ultimately, you are relying on the wider cohort of stakeholders to influence that. And so actually when you go to market, you want to make sure that everybody is aligned on the same page. So as a given, there would always be sign off from a product marketer, a product representative. We would have somebody on the engineering side, usually the engineering lead that works with the product manager. We would have somebody on the solutions side, somebody on the sales side, and somebody on the marketing side. Now, if there was a legal or compliance angle to it, we might also have somebody from compliance, risk, or finance that signs off on it too. Again, you want to make sure that what you're saying, as a merchant of record, we're liable. So we want to make sure that we're being very intentional with our messaging and that we're not leaving ourselves open to any scrutiny, but we're also saying the right things to our customers. So I think depending on what the release is, there would be kind of a smaller or a longer list of people that would be involved. Now, the important part of that is that when people put their paw to it, when they sign it, they're basically saying that they're validating that everything in there is kind of true upon reflection. Now that doesn't mean that everybody's completely aligned with every bit of positioning that you do. Like if you speak to your salesperson, they're going to have a very different strategy on how you should go to market with something than what your CS person thinks or what your marketing person might think. But I think actually the important part of this is that when you work cross-functionally and you have other people involved, even if it's not their way at the end, just bringing them on that journey really helps at the end result to get the sign off and to be able to take it to market. So I think even when it isn't completely somebody's way, they at least have that kind of unified way of thinking, well, actually this is fair, I can understand why we've come to this assumption, and look, let's kind of see how it lands. And there's always that opportunity to kind of feedback on things that can be done better.
Makes sense, yeah. What stage does product marketing get involved with product, by the way? Is it that the product communicates that, hey, we're planning on building this feature, or is it more we're ideating on this, can you participate? Or is it more that, hey, we have a working prototype, we have a working product, now go release it? It's like, at what point do we get involved?
I would love to always say it's at discovery stage, but it isn't always at discovery stage. And I have worked in organizations whereby, in fact, my first product marketing role was an interesting one because we had a lot of friction between the sales and the product org, where we were tending to prioritize big ticket items that kind of new customers had wanted. And actually, what we weren't doing was building things that were scalable and repeatable. We weren't factoring in kind of incremental improvements for our customers. And so there was a lot of friction amongst the teams. And actually, what we decided to do was, PMM was then kind of almost like the peacemaker, where it was like, well, look, if you feel passionately about one of the items on the stack rank, then we work on a market requirements document and we scope out kind of what the risk is of not doing this release. What would this mean? What competitors in our space are doing it? How could we monetize this? How much effort would it take from an engineering resource perspective? And then once you've got those insights, it's interesting actually because it really focuses the mind. There's some people that are like, there's a lot of effort to do this. Maybe I don't care so passionately about this one. But ultimately, what it did was it kind of helped to make things a bit more fair. So again, when you were doing releases, even if again it wasn't always on the side of a customer, or it wasn't always kind of what a specific region wanted, at least it was kind of a bit fairer. So that's the way that we used to have like a product steering group. At Paddle, it kind of varies. There are some things we have to react to quite quickly. Like compliance is a non-negotiable. Something comes in, it has to get reacted to straight away. It often moves other things off the roadmap for a time being, and it becomes a focus. So there's no discovery in that. That's straight into we're building this, it's happening. But there are kind of stages, and I think particularly as I'm growing the team, I'm keen for the team to get involved a bit earlier. So I think the as early as we can is always really important. And I think where we've moved a bit more to this squad mentality, what you get is kind of people that are a bit more specialist in their domains. And so they're able to really support the product managers in the earlier stages with the market insights, sharing some of the load with speaking to customers or garnering market and competitive insight early on before we get to that stage of building. So it's not one or the other at the moment. It's somewhere in between. But the ideal state, I think, is to bring PMMs in as early as possible.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think this is obviously a global problem to solve.
It
Almost every organization that we speak to will have the same problems, right? Of course, PMMs would say the earlier
absolutely.
the better. And of course, there's always the other side of the story as well.
Of course.
What you also touched upon, roadmap is super interesting, and I'm keen to touch on that subject. Does PMM have a heavy influence on the roadmap? And if so, how does that process look like?
Yeah, again, that's a great question, and I think it varies from company to company. As I've said to you before, I think I've had a bigger influence on the roadmap in previous organisations where I was part of more of that steering committee. And again, very agnostic. I don't have a preference any side. I want to produce the best things to market. But I think being able to produce those market requirements documents and actually coming with lots of different levels and reasoning as to why these things are important helps to really make informed decisions as to what goes on the roadmap. And actually, what was really interesting about that steering group was that it was owned by myself and the CTO at the time. And actually, what we did was we had quarterly releases back in that organization. And actually, what we did was, as a kind of general rule of thumb, and there would be a give and take each way. It was like we allocated a block of time for each of the types of releases. So 70% of that might be for new innovation, new release material features. And then like 20% of that might be on kind of incremental improvements for customers. And then 10% might kind of be support, bug fixes, things that kind of have been on the back burner, not the most exciting things to do, but would make a difference to kind of solve for. And so the way in which we saw and looked at things was very different. I think at Paddle, we don't as influence as much. I think we do have an impact. I think sometimes some of our insights are a bit late coming. We're able to kind of collect some of those insights too along the way and feed those into product, which I think is really important. And actually, more importantly, is not just the stuff that comes through our kind of commercial org, but the stuff that comes from our customers. Like there's so many conversations that I have with customers that are so important to translate back to the product team to get them thinking about what's the priority on the roadmap. Ultimately, they own it. I think that we partner very well, so they certainly help. They certainly talk things through with us to help to make decisions. But and I'd say we have some influence, but I think that will grow over time as we start to be involved a bit earlier.
That makes sense, yeah. Is there a requirement from the commercial teams that you've noticed where they want to sell the bigger picture that's beyond, let's say, the quarterly roadmap that you're referring to, right? Because How do you manage this conversation? Of course, like from our perspective, we want to share more, but there's obviously some sensitive information that you would want to cover up a little bit. But so you, as much as you would want to protect, there's obviously a commercial requirement for them because obviously there's all of the other competitors in the market are also sharing their roadmap. So it's very tricky. How do you compete and how do you project to the customer that we're going in this direction, the competitor is going in a different direction? How do we find that balance? How do you have this conversation with the revenue team?
Yes, that is sometimes a challenge. I'm of the opinion that you're better to be transparent about things, right? And that's transparent, but when you know something is viable, you don't tell sales when you've got this idea because they'll go and sell it tomorrow, right? That's just the nature of sales. Um, but I think what's really important is just to have that transparency early on. And actually something that we pivoted to last year at Paddle, like I've always worked in organizations previously where the roadmap was very open. It was very kind of centralized, but it was caveated. It was like, this is not customer facing. This is us giving you an update on what's coming. But some of these things are likely to move. So X, Y, and Z is wedded into the roadmap, and it's definitely happening within this time frame. But these things might slip. And I think having that kind of openness and transparency built that kind of trust in the organization where it was like, if you go and sell this, that's on you because that's not what we've told you to do. But I think it's a difficult thing to change, right? And actually, when I first got to Paddle, I think there was sometimes a reticence to share too much because there was this concern that they would potentially go out and sell something that would potentially move. But I think what we've got now is we found some sort of happy medium. So we do have an internal facing roadmap that's very open. Anyone can ask questions about that at any point in time. I think the difference now is that I bring product managers into our QBRs. So if we've got some big releases that are coming in the next quarter, I think it's nice to hear about these things that are even in build or things that are coming later in the year from the product managers directly. So it's in a safe environment. We can be very clear and descriptive around what you should and shouldn't say. Um, but also, I think we've got better with timings too. So I think in the past we had got very hung up on dates, and actually we work to quarters now. So if something is, if something's being released in Q3, for example, that will be the last month of Q3. Now, we won't give a specific date till we get closer to it, so we know exactly when. So that way, we're not kind of stinging ourselves when it comes to customers or to prospects, and we're managing expectations a bit more. Invariably, sometimes things do change. Like I've said, we're an MOR, compliance things come in, stuff gets moved out. And I think, again, the important thing is to make sure that people are aware of the changes and why that's changed. And I think, generally speaking, like, people are accepting of things move, like that's human nature. So as long as you're kind of clear and you've given enough notice of those things, it doesn't tend to be a problem. But I honestly think that openness and transparency is the best way. You give people the trust, and then you trust them not to over egg features or promise them too early.
Extremely solid input, Daniel. Thank you so much. Really, really appreciate all of the input up until now. Before we go, is there any last piece of advice that you want to share?
I think the one thing that I would say, and actually it comes a bit down to messaging, is that I think that it's really important that you're consistent with your messaging, but I think it's also important to distinguish between the different audiences that you're speaking to. So I think when it comes to going to market, you have to be really mindful of the places that you're putting this message, and appreciating that different segments, different markets, different personas will receive the information in different ways. So consistency is key. You don't want like hundreds of different variations of your product feature, but you need to meet people where they are as well. So for example, if you're speaking to a tech persona, they don't care about the fluffy stuff. Like they're like, is this system robust? Is it scalable? Does it serve our needs? How difficult is this going to make it? How difficult is it going to be to implement and maintain? Like they care about a different set of things. So I think it's really important to make sure that you have that in mind so that when you're distributing things across the relevant channels, you have your kind of demographic, you have your persona in mind to make sure that, yes, it's consistent, but it's not completely the same. So I think that would be my key thing is like, there's always this thing around having the same message, but I think it's important to have that distinction between being consistent and being the same.
100%. Yeah, consistency matters a lot, and you don't want your customers or your revenue team speaking like two or three different things, or even more. Hopefully not more. Thanks so much, Danielle. That's a lot of input. That's great. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast, and really, really appreciate your time.
Amazing. Thank you so much for having me.